how much sex comes up in conversation around the world. Have you guys ever noticed that? You guys thought I was going to say a different word. I would not. I mean, but like, seriously, in the music that we listen to, in the movies that we watch, in the conversations maybe in the bathroom around the lunch table, the subject of sex gains a lot of attention in our world. And maybe you've had a moment in your life where you suddenly realize, holy cow, every single country song is either about someone dying or it's about sex. Or maybe you're like, man, every single advertisement I've ever seen, like almost 90% of them somehow use sexuality to sell something. And you're like, what is the deal? Like maybe you had this aha moment, and maybe it was like right after puberty, I don't know. But like maybe you're like, oh my word, everything that people talk about a lot of times is sexual in nature. And there's something so casual about the way that people talk about it. They're just like, not a big deal. Because the reality is sex and sexual activity in our world today seem like such a casual idea. Now, before we get too far into our conversation today, what I want to do is clarify a couple things. First of all, when I talk about sex and sexual activity, I'm referring to two different things. Sex, obviously, is just the physical act of sex, but sexual activity is anything that is sexual in nature that somebody does, right? Whether it's a sexual touch or just even kissing or talking sexual about something, right? It's some sort of sexual activity in nature is broader than just the idea of the word sex. And so what I was talking about earlier, these two things are becoming incredibly pervasive. It's no longer something that I would expect a middle schooler to be ignorant of the fact that like it's just everywhere, right? Now, I would hope that you're innocent of a lot of things, and I would hope that this is a conversation that you've dealt with in a very healthy way. The best case scenario, you've had some really good conversations at home, and if you guys have any questions about stuff like this, you can always talk to me, but I highly recommend chatting with your parents, because in my belief, that is a great place to have conversations like this. But I'm not naive enough to think that this conversation has never happened in your mind up until this point. Like there is some level at which you've been exposed to sex or sexual activity in your amazingly long 13 years of life. I'm just shooting on average here, but you hear people talk about it sometimes as if it's no big deal, or as if maybe it's casual, or maybe your parents or your friends talk, and it's like this thing that is so not a big deal. Whether people are talking about their own experiences, or making jokes, or simply asking questions, I've known enough middle schoolers to realize that this is a topic of conversation that people talk about younger and younger and younger. They say the average first exposure to sexual things in nature is now like in kindergarten age, right? Like that is a normal thing in this age of the internet. Like every single one of us, I think, most of us at least, grew up most of our lives at least, if not all of our lives, with the internet. So everybody in this room is going like, yeah, I get the fact that this is a conversation that is more available, more accessible, and a lot of times brought to us at a younger and younger age. Whether it's in the books or the movies or the shows or the music that you guys are exposed to, they all seem to have at least some level of sexual content. Or maybe it's an extreme amount. Can we talk Game of Thrones for a second, right? Like, maybe it's like a super inappropriate amount of sexual content, and you're like, that is way too much. And all of a sudden, you begin to realize that your world, our world, treats sex and sexual activity so casually. And you might be wondering, why is it that everyone talks about sexual things so casually? And I think there's a few answers to that question. First, for starters, I think a lot of times people want to prove something. Because it's kind of a mature idea, mature concept, people want to prove that maybe I'm at a certain level of maturity It makes me feel grown up. It makes me sound cool. It makes me sound experienced. Or maybe it helps me deal with loneliness. Like, it makes me feel connected to somebody else in a way that nobody else has really ever understood. Or maybe just because it's off limits, honestly, it just sounds kind of exciting because it's like, ooh, man, I'm not allowed to get anywhere near that idea. Or maybe to some people, sex is something you should just absolutely not do, not talk about, completely avoid altogether. And so there's always been this negativity surrounding it, and you have no idea, and there's a lot of curiosity. So no matter the reason that it's talked about in your world, I think the idea that I want to talk about today is that sex is not as simple as the world says it is. It's not. Sexual things are not quite as simple as your world would make you think. Like we said before, the messages we get from our culture make touching another person's body seem like this casual thing, right? The problem with this approach, though, is that treating sexual activity casually hurts us more than we realize. It's true. Why? Because even though it's portrayed as this thing that's not that big of a deal, all of these sexual actions are actually more powerful than we realize. And we're going to look at a passage in the Bible today that comes from a guy who was writing to a church that was in a town called Corinth. And Corinth was like a bustling metropolis. It was like Petoskey, you know what I mean? It was this huge city. I'm just kidding, Petoskey is quaint compared to some of the bigger cities, but you get my point. Like, it was this big, huge city, hub of culture in that area, and sex was treated as this super casual thing that it was no big deal. Like, it was everywhere. Literally, they found rubble and ruins from the city of Corinth. There was pornography on all of just normal house walls. Like, it was just a normal thing. It was so casual, pervasive, and everywhere. And so Paul writes this letter, book of 1 Corinthians. If you have a Bible, turn to 1 Corinthians. He writes this to a church saturated in a culture that was so casual about sexual things. And this idea of casualness about sexuality began to invade that church. And this was messed up. Hey, guys, if we could wait for the bathroom trips till after the message, that would be amazing. Can you come and sit down? My man, thank you. Okay, so back to what I was saying, is that, like, he's writing this letter to this church where people are dealing with sex and sexual activity so casually in the church, like people were sleeping with relatives, like incest was happening in the church, right? And this is what he says. Here it is. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. I highly recommend turning there in your Bible. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18. Here it is. Flee. Who knows what the word flee means? Yeah. Go away. Okay, good. Flee from sexual immorality. I even add to that. Flee is not just go away, but like go away in a hurry in the opposite direction. Run away. Be gone. Yeah, I like that. That's a good one. Flee sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits, like, people can commit a whole lot of sins that aren't sexual, right? But every other sin a person commits is outside of the body. But the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own. I mean, Paul means business, doesn't he? Like, he gets straight to it. And he starts off immediately by telling the Christians in Corinth to run from sexual sin. In fact, if he could borrow some common phrases from today, Paul would say, man, gear up in your best pair of Nikes, hit the road as fast as you can in the opposite direction of any kind of sexual sin. Like, flee sexual immorality. That's right. Yes. Lace up your J's, your Max Airs. There we go. But to get away from the idea that being sexual with somebody was this this casual thing you could experiment and just not have a whole lot of consequences with, and just treat sexual activity very casually. Paul's saying, no. This is actually very serious. This is something that actually affects your physical body. And I think it's interesting that Paul, he chooses the word flee or run. He doesn't say just like walk away. He doesn't say just drop it. He said like run away. Get as far away from it as possible, as fast as possible. Like take off running, don't look back. And be serious about removing yourself from sexual sin. And it's the same advice, I think, guys. I think it's the same advice that Paul would give each one of you guys today. Each one of us, myself, your leaders, you guys, we need to run from anything that would encourage us to treat sexual things and sexual activities like they don't matter, like they're not that big of a deal. Run away as fast as possible. Why? Because when we treat sexual activity casually, when we treat sex casually, we are hurting both others and ourselves. What do I mean? Paul says that no other sin, no other thing that's outside of God's best for us, right? No other sin is going to impact us the way that sexual sin will impact us. Sex, guys, I need you to pay attention. This is so important. Sex outside of God's design hurts us because it's not recognizing and honoring the value inherent in every single human being that God has placed inside of us. Like God has designed sexual activity for one specific purpose that's within the realms of a biblical marriage. And anything outside of that devalues the person that God created. It does not recognize the honor and the value that God has put inside of that person or inside of us. God created us for a purpose, a reflection of His creativity, of His goodness, of His love for us, of His generosity. And here's the truth. When we don't stay within the design that God created us for, when we don't follow His plan for our sexuality, and we give in to sexual sin, we are dishonoring the masterpiece that God designed each one of us to be. We are devaluing the masterpiece. Imagine this. Imagine for a moment that I went to the most famous guitar shop in the world. And I went to the guitar shop owner, and he's very famous for creating the most beautiful guitars on planet Earth. This is not one of them, but just imagine in your sanctified imagination for a moment that I went in and he created the most beautiful, stunning guitar that sounds like it came from heaven. And it looks like it was made of pure gold. And it is just this beautiful work of art called a guitar made by the masterpiece. By the master. It's like his masterpiece. He spent years and years and years making his guitar. And I bought it for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Right? It's the best work ever. And then I take that guitar out, and I'm like, I am so glad I have this. This is going to make the best oar for my boat ever. And I just start rowing with it, right? This would be an amazing oar for a canoe or a raft or a boat, right? And I just start rowing with it. And you're like, no! That's a masterpiece of a guitar. You just devalued it by using it for something other than what it was designed for. And Paul is saying, guys, when you take your human sexuality and you use it in a way other than God designed it for, you are absolutely you are absolutely devaluing, by your use, devaluing what God designed it for. It's going to hurt you. It's going to hurt somebody else by devaluing what God designed them for, their sexuality. Before I keep going on with this, I do want to recognize, maybe some of you have experienced the impact of sexual sin in your life. Maybe your parents' marriage fell apart because of an affair, or maybe you know someone who's experienced the negative consequence of sex forced upon them, or maybe that's you, and you're like, someone devalued me, and I want you to know for sure that God is not angry at you. First of all, God is incredibly angry at people who would devalue somebody else, especially forcefully in a sexual manner. And maybe you feel like you're dealing with lots of guilt and shame from the way that you've been treated, or that a sexual activity was forced upon you, or maybe you've been tempted with a sexual thought. And I want to stop and just say that this verse is not directed towards victims of sexual abuse. If you've been abused, God does not hold you accountable for somebody else's sin. And I'm absolutely passionately angry at the fact that someone thought it would be okay to use you for their sexual gratification. And I'm sorry that you've experienced living with the pain of sexual abuse in your life. That's not what God wants for you. It's not what He designed you for, and you didn't have a choice in that matter. So this verse isn't talking to that. If you need someone to talk to, I'd love to chat with you, or your small group leader would, or I can definitely connect you with a counselor, because I think those are some things that are worth talking through. But that being said, what Paul is warning us about in this verse was something so many of us, I think, already know, is that when we treat sexual activity casually, we're going to be hurt deeply. I'll say it again. When we treat sexual activity casually, when we use our sexuality outside of the design for which it was made, we use it casually, we're going to be hurt deeply. We're going to experience effects that we were never designed to experience because we stepped outside of the design of the sexuality, or of the design for our human sexuality. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, deep down, guys, we know Paul's right. We understand that our mistakes and our regrets related to sexual activity are sometimes they're the hardest ones to get over. Sometimes they're the ones that linger the longest. And when we make choices that treat sex casually, we can start heading towards the area of sexual sin. Okay, and I'm going to just designate this corner as the sexual sin corner, okay? Because when we begin to take actions, sexual actions, the idea of sex very casually, we begin to slowly drift towards sexual sin. Things that are outside of God's design for us. Now, you might be sitting there going, okay, that's great, but how do I know when I'm headed towards sexual sin? Like when do I know that I've crossed the line? Like how close can I get until I'm actually stepping into sexual sin, right? Like what's the action that means I've gone too far? Right? Can I flirt with somebody? Can I hold hands with somebody? Can I interlock fingers while I'm holding hands with somebody? Can I kiss somebody just by blowing them a kiss? Can I kiss someone on the head? Like, you know what I mean? Like, how far until I've crossed the line? And I think if that's the question you're asking, to be honest, you're heading in the wrong direction. Like, the point is not to go, how close can I get to God's, like, how far away from God's best for me can I get before I'm not experiencing it anymore? Right? Like, how close to the ledge can I get before I fall off? Guys, that is a dangerous way to live. Maybe a better way to think about it is because God designed sex. So think about this. The reason we're talking about this in youth group is because God invented it, right? Like, this isn't something that came from the world and now us as Christians were like, wow, what do we do about that? Ah! Like, the reason we're talking about it, God invented it. It's a good thing. But I think because God made sex, sexual things matter. The way that we think about it, the way we deal with it matters. And Paul encourages these people to literally run away, run the other direction from a casual approach to sex and sexual activity, and to embrace something that God actually intended it to be, something important that matters. It's a good gift from God if we use it the right way. And here's the cool part. When we run away from something, generally we're running towards something else. Right? If we run away from sexual sin, if we're not asking the question, how close can I get? But more like, how far away can I get from it? What we are doing is we're running towards a thing called sexual integrity. Right? We are becoming somebody worth looking up to, somebody full of honor, somebody full of love, somebody full of joy, somebody full of hope, somebody full of peace. Like, we are running towards God's best for us. And when we live within the design that God made us for, that's when we begin to experience the blessings of everything that God created us for. We're running towards integrity. So the reminder that I want to come back to is this, that God made sex, and because of that, sexual things matter. And regardless, guys, seriously, regardless of what the world around you wants you to think about this is the truth, that when we start treating sexual activity like it matters, the way that Paul was talking about, the way that God intended for us, we're beginning to take a step towards God's best for our lives. And honestly, that's what Paul wanted. That's what I want. I want God's absolute best for your life. Do you realize you actually have a choice to run away or run towards God's best for your life? God has an amazing plan and design already thought out for your life. And you can scrap that, or you can embrace it and run towards it. God has a design laid out. God has a plan. God has a will revealed for your life, and it's the way that your life will operate at its absolute peak, at its best. And when we run towards that, when we embrace it, then we begin to experience all of the blessings that God has for us and the best that He has for our lives. When we choose to think that it doesn't really matter, that maybe I can just pick it up on Sundays, maybe, I don't know, I'm not going to bring it to youth group. I don't really need it. I'm not going to bring it to school. I'm going to forget about it. I'm going to dust it off. And you know what? It's been a few weeks. It's all right. I got most of it understood. I got the general idea. Yeah, I think there's a verse in there. One, God helps those who help themselves. Not a Bible verse. You know what? That's kind of a weird book. And all of a sudden, when we begin to marginalize, when we begin to put to the side, when we begin to just kind of disregard God's best for our lives, all of a sudden, our other option is picking up somebody else's best for our lives, or what we think is best for our life. And all of a sudden, this idea of sexual sin becomes a really good idea. And we experience brokenness, and we experience hurt, and we experience pain, or we put that on somebody else. And God's like, I've got a good plan. I designed it to work out really well. Like, I know how this works best, because I invented it, and it matters. Now, I understand that at times you might be unsure where you're at in this idea of like running towards sexual sin or running towards integrity. Where am I at? Like this thought or that word or this movie, like where on the spectrum is it? And I get that, right? You may or may not have past experiences with this whole idea of what I'm talking about. But what I want to encourage you is this, that we can all begin to take steps towards God's best for our lives. And the first step that we can take is to run away from a casual view of sex. That's the world's view. This idea of sexual sin, it doesn't really matter. Run the other way. We can run away from that by you know what, that wasn't really that funny of a joke. I'm not going to laugh at that joke. That was pretty crude. Maybe it's the YouTube videos or the movies that we see or the TV shows or the music we listen to. There's like an E with a box around it, right next to the song. I'll be a little harsh. Maybe that's not a good song to listen to. Maybe explicit songs aren't that great to listen to, or maybe the links that we click on online, we need to get rid of that. Or maybe it's just the conversations that we were part of, or the pictures that we look at. Or the way that we treat ourselves. We flaunt certain things to other people. Or we talk about ourselves in sexual ways. Like, maybe those things, we can begin to run the other direction. And stop blaming everybody else. And go, I'm going to take ownership and start to be a person of integrity. I'm going to do it God's way. I'm going to experience God's best for my life. And the truth is, if maybe you've already been in this area, you're like, I've already stepped into the sexual sin. Guys, here's the promise of hope and forgiveness of Jesus Christ. Today is the beginning of the rest of your life. From here on forward, you can have a clean record. Right? Isn't it amazing? That's a message of hope. That is a message of forgiveness. That from here on forward, you can begin to take steps towards being a person of integrity. You don't have to worry about what your past has been like. The second thing, the first one is we can take steps away from the world's view of sexual sin. The second thing is we can begin to take steps towards God's plan for integrity in our lives. In other words, we can begin to operate in a way that sex actually matters and is a good thing, but it's designed by God. Right? I can set boundaries around sexual activity in my life, so I leave it for the design for which it was intended within marriage. Like, I can begin to utilize my sexuality in a good way, the way God intended it, by keeping it for my spouse someday. Right? I can begin not to think it's a bad thing, but to think it's a good thing, and it's going to be opened on the right day. Right? I can begin to not be alone with my boyfriend or girlfriend, right? Set a limit on our sexual time. Like, we don't have to be sexual at all. Like, I know my friends talk about it. I know it's kind of this thing that I see in movies, but like, I don't have to be part of that. Maybe we can actually be really good close boyfriend and girlfriend, really good friends, and never go sexual. That's a possibility, guys. I know that's kind of like a weird thing in our culture, but what if you didn't actually have to have a whole lot of hurt or pain when you break up, if you break up, because, man, you've never really crossed any boundaries. And you're like, yeah, we're still really good friends, and we have trust between us, and like, nothing is really lost because we made sure we lived with integrity. Like, the truth is this: we can begin to move towards God's best for our lives, right? We can resist sexual sin and run towards God's best. Right? Maybe it means having a change in friend groups. Maybe it means getting rid of a particular device. Maybe it means making just a decision that I'm not going to laugh at some of those jokes or be part of those conversations, or I'm not going to be involved in whatever that thing is. You're like, that keeps pulling me towards sexual sin, away from God's best for my life. Because the truth is this, that when you're choosing to run towards God's best for your life, to move towards integrity, I promise you it is the best choice you could make for yourself, both now and later. God invented sex, and because of that, it matters. Like, it's not this casual thing. Like, it is a good thing, but it matters. And if you haven't been treating it this way, one of the best things about God is that He loves you, that He wants the best for you, and He forgives you, and He can give you new strength, new grace, new power to run towards His best for your life. He can give you new hope, new peace, new forgiveness. He can give you a new start starting today. I want to encourage you guys, go ahead and bow your heads and close your eyes. I get that this message is kind of difficult for some. I get that this might be hitting right in a spot of conviction for some of you guys, and for others of you, you're like, I've never thought about this. So it's kind of somewhere in that range there. I know it's hard to run away from something that the world just thinks is not a big deal. But what I want to encourage you to do is think about this. Maybe ask this question. Do I think I'm experiencing God's best for me when it comes to how He designed my sexuality? Do I think that, like, in some way I'm compromising that? Do I think that in some way I'm running away from God's best when it comes to my sexuality? And if you are, everyone's eyes are closed and heads are bowed. I don't want to embarrass you. I just want to pray for you right here. I don't want anyone even to be looking around, right, guys? I don't want anyone to be looking around. But like, if you're like, Pastor Brant, I'm not experiencing, in fact, I'm running away from God's best for my life, or I have in the past, and I want to get back towards God's best for my life. Would you pray for me? If that's you, would you just go ahead and slip up your hand? I just want to pray for you right now. That like, maybe for you, you're like, I want to run towards God's best for my life as far as my the design for my sexuality is concerned. Awesome, thank you. You can put your hands down as soon as you put them up. I know who you are. God knows who you are. I just want to pray for you really fast before we're done. Jesus, I just want to pray right now for each person who did raise their hand, but even maybe people who haven't, who maybe have never dealt with this before, but maybe someday in the future might. God, I know that this is such an important idea to run towards your best for our sexuality. God, I pray that you would help each one of us to be able to run away from sexual sin, away from the things that drag us towards sexual sin, and run towards integrity, run towards peace and joy and love that you've designed for us to experience when we live in the way that you designed us to live best. Lord, I pray that you would help us to live with integrity when it comes to our sexuality, and that we would be a shining example to the world around us of the genuine love that you have for us. Help us to be overcomers. Amen. We're going to head to small groups. I want you to think about this question. What's a way that the world around you is trying to get you to think about sex casually? And then you guys can maybe talk about that in your small groups. All the girls are going to head with Catherine in the girls' small group. All the guys, you guys are going to stick with me. And you guys